Welcome to Chicago Study's inaugural Urban October lecture, which has been co-sponsored by our friends at the Program on the Global Environment, as well as the University of Chicago's Urban Network. I'm Chris Scrable, the Director of Chicago Studies and Experiential Learning here in the college. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Chicago Studies, we're here to help the college form genuine bonds with Chicago's diverse communities by offering classes, programs, and resources that support students in being more than visitors while here, enabling them to have a positive impact on their new home. While you're here in 1155, we encourage you to walk through our space. We are just around the corner through the scary red hallway. You can also follow us on social media or visit us on our website to learn more. Hopefully you've already taken advantage of one or more Chicago Studies programs. If not, our website's really easy. Chicago Studies, uchicago.edu/events will get you to almost everything that we're doing. And there are still many things to come this quarter. Before we go any further in the evening, I wanted to just take a moment to mark the passing of Dr. Timuel Black. Some of you may have seen already news that Tim passed away yesterday at the age of 102. Tim was a civil rights activist, but I knew him mostly as an historian of the South Side. An author, a great storyteller, and someone who gave a lot to this institution, much more than he was given when he was conferred a degree. There were many great tributes to Tim in the Tribune and on NPR. Really great episode this morning on CityCast Chicago with Natalie Moore talking about the legacy of Timuel Black. But maybe we could all just take a moment of silence and be grateful for all that he offered to the Southside communities and to this institution. Thank you. Tonight's presentation marks the beginning of a focus for Chicago Studies on our city's relationship to its rapidly changing climate. Our presenter, Dr. Harold Platt, will be taking us on a journey through our local history in order to set up future conversations, also hosted by Chicago Studies and the Program on the Global Environment, among others, about the challenges that our city and region face from our rapidly changing global climate. These challenge-focused conversations, in turn, will give way to a discussion of how we, as individuals, as a city, and as a region, might best respond to and prepare for those changes, both for the sake of improving upon our own climate resilience and also in the hope of fulfilling our potential to offer sanctuary to climate refugees from parts of our country and world that are even more vulnerable than we. Of course, not all of these important reflections should be scholarly in the traditional sense. Chicago Studies isn't a major, but rather a focus on our immediate surroundings, our neighboring communities that can be expressed in a wide range of disciplines and discourses. And so we're also excited to announce a new partnership with UChicago Public Arts this evening, a photo-based project entitled 100 Views of Lake Michigan that will culminate in a public arts exhibition that reflects on one of Chicago's most distinctive features. One we'll hear about tonight, I suspect, our proximity to the Great Lakes and specifically to Lake Michigan. More information about this collaboration and how you might participate is available on our website and on posters that you will find just outside this auditorium. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Tess Conway, Programming Coordinator for the Urban Curricular Programs in the college. Tess will introduce our speaker this evening. Tess.
Thanks, Chris. So, as Chris said, tonight's lecture will be presented by Professor Harold L. Platt. He's Professor Emeritus of American History at Loyola University Chicago. Professor Platt received his PhD from Rice University and has been a professor at Loyola for over 30 years. His research explores historical and contemporary relationships between cities, technologies, especially those related to urban infrastructure, public policy, and environmental sustainability. Professor Platt's attention to the political and even sociological implications of urban infrastructure as a way of understanding the growth and development of cities has significantly expanded the field of environmental and urban studies. Professor Platt is the author of a long list of published works, including Just in Part, city building in the New South, the growth of public services in Houston, Texas, the electric city, energy, and the growth of the Chicago area, Shack cities, the environmental transformation and reform of Manchester and Chicago, building the urban environment, visions of the organic city in the United States, Europe, and Latin America, and most recently, 2018's Singing Chicago, climate change and the remaking of a flood-prone environment, which will be the focus of this evening's lecture. Please note that we do have copies of this book for sale after tonight's event, and I think we can even coax Professor Platt to sign a couple. Professor Platt is also an active member in several associated organizations, including the Chicago Historical Society, the American Historical Association, the Urban History Association, and the American Society for Environmental History. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Platt.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming. And first, let me give thanks to Chris and to Tess. They did all the hard work to put this together. And I also should give a shout out to Joe here, who actually makes all this technology work far beyond my realm at this point. So tonight, I hope to provide you with some answers about the current conditions and future status of the Great Lakes and our region's beautiful natural landscape, our prairie wetlands and river watersheds. My project to integrate long-term climate change into urban environmental history began when I was listening to a national public radio program, and the scientists being interviewed made a big point that you needed at least 50 years of statistics to study climate change. I knew from previous research that Chicago had been keeping weather records since the time of the Great Fire of 1871. And actually, this is the time that cities throughout the United States and Europe began collecting standardized weather records. So let me start with a little bit of science to put Chicago in its ecological setting. It's land, water, and air. Then we can deal with the ways humans have changed it. I want to lay out three basic definitions so that we begin at least on the same page. First, climate change is long-term patterns, such as this chart shows here, clearly from the 1900s to about 1945, 1950 was a relatively dry period. In other words, all those green lines going down show that the annual precipitation was less than the long-term average. And since about 1945, we have been in an ongoing period of more and more rain. Okay. Second, the weather is day-to-day conditions. A severe rainstorm or a heat wave can occur at any time in dry years and wet years. So there's a difference between weather is kind of short-term, day-to-day, and climate change is these much longer-term patterns. Third, we have to understand that floods, like forest fires caused by lightning, are natural, right? We have floods, we have flood plains when the rivers go over their banks. It's a natural thing. In contrast, flood damages are human-made. Okay, so when we deal with the damages caused by floods, we're dealing with, in a sense, human-caused problems, often like building a house right on the floodplain, right? And the flood water goes up and you're going to get flooded. Okay. Of course, Chicago is not unique. It's a part of much larger weather and climate change patterns. So I want to drill down on Chicago's natural and engineered drainage. In other words, where does the rain go? Once it comes down on the land, what happens? Okay. Here is a chart plotting the number of times a year we have rainfall of 1 inch or more in a 24-hour period. We have gone, as you can see, from an average of 6 times a year in the 1900s to 9 times now. This represents a 50% increase over this period. Well, you might be thinking, what's the big deal? 1 inch of rain, right? We have been seeing lately on TV these torrential storms in places like the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and Texas that have been getting hit with 6 inches to a foot of rain in a 24-hour period. In the case of Chicago, a 1-inch rainfall is important for several reasons. First, our sewer system was built back then and remains today designed to handle a maximum of 1 inch of rain. More than that, the sewers are going to overflow. Second, 1 inch of rain coming down on a square mile is actually a lot of water. 17.5 million gallons, okay, in 1 square mile. Now, if you take the metropolitan reclamation districts, water reclamation districts, 872 square miles, you're dealing with 15 billion gallons of water. And if you expand that to Chicago's statistical area of 10,000 square miles, we're talking of dealing with 1.9 trillion gallons of water coming down, let's say, in a 24-hour period. Now, that's a lot of water. Where does it go? Since the very beginning of the city in the 1850s, when we actually began to grow as a city, we faced a choice. We could either build a combined sewer system or a separate system. And as the diagram shows, maybe I could even use my little laser thing here. Okay. In a combined system, both the runoff from the street and the sewage from our house combines together. Usually it goes to the sewage treatment plant and then is entered into the Chicago River or some other outlet. But when it rains too much, it overflows and we get contaminated water flowing into our water courses. The alternative, which London was exploring in the 1850s, was to separate the two so that the sewage goes to the treatment plant, and if there's an overflow from the streets, it's just storm water, but not contaminated. From the 1850s, we've always chosen the combined system. Why? It's cheaper. So at several times when we face severe floods, at different times of adding and annexing areas to the city or adding areas to the Metropolitan Water District, there were choices to be made that new construction could be built with separate sewers. We always rejected that and took the cheaper alternative. Okay. This means, the bottom line here, what I'm trying to get at, it means that pollution control and flood control are inseparable in the case of Chicago, right? You have to deal with one, you deal with the other. Okay. Now, let's add on to this what the human have done. We've basically paved over a prairie wetland. As you can see in this picture, and from 1900 to the end of World War II, there was some suburbanization, some sprawl, you might say. But look, from 1950 to 2000, it was a massive deconcentration after World War II. What we had after the war was a baby boom and a housing boom. And what this means is that we paved over the surface. Where's the water to go? It can't soak into the ground anymore. All those rooftops, all those sidewalks, all those streets, all those parking lots and shopping malls, paving over. Where's the water going to go? What we do is that we create a problem of surface runoff surges. In other words, when it rains, all that water has nowhere to go except maybe towards the sewers. The result basically is lots and lots of floods, damaging floods. One thing that probably the worst flooding problem in Chicago is basement floods. And this comes from the backflow. When the sewers fill up with that 1 inch of rain and the pressure from the street is all that rain wants to go down into the sewers, down into the drains, what happens? The sewers fill up and start backflowing. And they can backflow up into people's basements because the water is higher, right, on the street level than at the bottom of your basement. And this has caused incredible damages to many, many, many people, white and black, whatever. The floods don't discriminate on that basis. Another problem, of course, are houses after World War II that more and more developers built on the floodplains. It's nice to have a house near the river, right? The Des Plaines River, the Chicago River, the Salt Creek, whatever. But these are floodplains. So again, nature, when it rains heavy, overflows the banks onto what scientists would call the floodplain, and you've got a house underwater. Okay. I call Chicago a flood-prone environment. We are flood-prone because of our geography. We are very flat, right? Which means we have really very bad drainage. Okay, if we go back to the last ice age, we can see that where Chicago is now, and I've got a little circle around the main channel of the Chicago River up there and down there. We can see that Chicago, most of Chicago was underwater, was part of the lake, right? And then as the water receded, what we were left with was 6 river watersheds that I describe over here. Again, the land is flat, the rivers are flat. These are not big Mississippi River type of things, but very flat land. That's why I call us a prairie wetland. Worse, this flat land often becomes saturated because of an impermeable, get that word out, layer of clay just under the surface, maybe 50 to 100 feet down. There's this layer of clay. So in a sense, if you think of Chicago's almost like a bathtub with the plug in. You fill up the bathtub with soil, turn on the shower, what's going to happen? For a while, the water will soak in to the soil, but pretty quickly, the bathtub comes filled up and the water is going to spill over the top. That's sort of what we're dealing with here. The water can't keep soaking down, and you add to that all the surface paving over, and we've got real problems when there's a heavy rain. Our worst floods come after a few days of steady rain that saturates the soil, followed by a heavy downpour. Okay, so that's the science. Okay, a flat land, poor drainage, and a risk of floods with very little rain. In terms of environmental politics of a flood-prone environment, we have witnessed a historic battle to either engineer or save these rivers. After Chicago fire, Chicago grew by leaps and bounds. In fact, we became the fastest growing city in the Western world for the next 30 years. We hit from 500,000 in about 1870. We hit 1 million by 1890. We added another 750,000 over the 1890s, so that we were clearly the second city as we became called. And we had about almost 2 million people here at the turn of the century. The picture that we have here is the expansion of the sewer system, which expanded with the city as we paved over, built houses. You had to have sewers and drainage of the streets. And as we can, but the choice was that all of these sewers emptied into the river. That's it, all flowed that way, or directly into the lake. Along the lakefront, the sewers just dumped at 39th Street and so forth, just dumped the sewage right into the lake. So the Lake Michigan became the ultimate sink of a sense of Chicago. Where did the waste ultimately end up? In Lake Michigan. In the 1870s and 1880s, big storms would flush the river's sewage-laden wastewater into the lake. Pretty clear, it became clear that we were contaminating our own water supply. right? In the 1860s, we had built these tunnels under the lake 2 miles out to get fresh water. How could they build these incredible tunnels? Through the clay, right? They went through the clay. It's not so hard. You build bricks as you cut through the clay, and you've got an underground tunnel under the lake. Okay, so that's what we did at first, but clearly public health began to take top priority as we had to somehow stop polluting the lake and our drinking supplies with our own pollution. And again, for those in medical science, bacteriology, the science of germ theory began to grow in the 1870s and 1880s to make the connections that this contaminated water had bacteria that caused cholera and all these other diseases. We had to do something. So what we do is we turn things over to the engineers, and they will triumph in their solution to these problems, at least until the post-World War II era. What they did was that they reversed the Chicago River. This is supposed to be a great engineering miracle. Okay, what they did was, so you can see the sanitary and ship canal was completed in 1900. What they did was they cut through, as you can see, it was so flat, it was easy to cut through the soil and the ground here to make the water go in reverse downstream. Okay, we later had to add more canals to add water coming in from the North Shore up by Baha'i Temple, if anyone's gone up on Sheridan Road, and way down here, the Calumet River led to this Cal-Sag channel, also to keep adding more and more water to the system. The idea was that you had a dam at one end down here that would keep the river levels up. And then up here at the mouth of the river, you would set up locks so that you could control how much water was flowing from the lake to sort of flush all of this sewage and wastewater down the Illinois River towards St. Louis and the Mississippi. The idea was that it would dilute as it flowed down and it would become harmless, okay? Of course, it would take a great drainage of the Great Lakes as well, except for Niagara Falls, until this canal was built, was the only outlet for the whole Great Lakes was Niagara Falls. Now Chicago starts taking huge amounts of water, and the Great Lakes actually drop down about 6 inches. Okay, this leads to suits by all the other states in Canada, and the Supreme Court in the 20s will limit how much water we're allowed to take, and they still rule over us today in determining how much water we can drain out of Lake Michigan. Okay, so that was the solution. Free water from the lake. We don't have to put in sewage plants, but again, with the Supreme Court coming in, you can see by 1925, it had become this massive system of building sanitation plants and more engineering. I think at this point, we can see that the environment has been reduced to a blueprint. Okay. The drawback of the system is that if it rains too hard down here, you can only let so much water out of the dam, right? If you let too much water out of the dam, you're going to flood all of the downstream communities. So what can you do next if the water keeps coming? What's going to happen is the river is going to rise all the way back to Chicago. And if it rises 5 feet, the loop will start to flood. Oh my God, what are we going to do? The whole downtown's going to go underwater. Well, what do? The engineers open up the locks here at the opening, and all the pollution gushes out into the lake. That's the answer the engineers give us, right? The lake remains the ultimate sink under their system. When things go bad, well, we'll just open up the locks and the pollution will flow into the lake. And that's the system we still have today. Okay. But there were 3 routes of reform. I want to switch channels a little bit to save the lake and the rivers for recreation and leisure. These emerged during the progressive era at the end of the 19th century. They would come these three roots would come together to form what was called the conservation movement. And we sort of sometimes think of this with Teddy Roosevelt and maybe FDR a little with the conservation movement. It was city-based too. And Chicago became a leader. So let's look at these roots. Here we can clearly see a two-phase social geography. The first route was the City Beautiful movement, largely led by the middle class, and they also led the creation of the World's Fair. We created a two-phase geography of the front yard, the lakefront, and the back alley, the river. The first mission of the City Beautiful movement was to save the lakefront for the affluent, while the riverfront became the back alley of the city where the poor lived next to the factories. This movement, which seemed like a good thing, City Beautiful, let's clean the city up, let's make flowers, let's make more parks and so forth, helped cement a social geography of class and ethnic segregation into the built environment. It was already there. This helps to cement it in there. A second route was the outdoor recreation movement. And this was led by Jane Addams and Hull House, who promoted the idea of organized play for children, right? They need to go outside, they need to play, but it has to be organized, it has to be sort of, the adults will tell them how to do it. And this led, as we can see here, to the city's first playgrounds, the first ones for the school. This was beginning in the 1890s, 1900s. It's hard to imagine that it took that long, but we had no playgrounds for our public or private schools until then, let alone little parks. There was also a men's movement. It was called Muscular Christianity, and it turned the YMCA from prayer rooms until football teams and so forth, gymnasiums for men and women. The efforts would result in a citywide network of neighborhood parks and school playgrounds. On a larger scale, of course, people wanted to get outside. The city was growing. It was becoming more and more a cement place. People couldn't find green space. And so they wanted to get outside. And bicycles came along, technology came along in the 1890s just at the right time. And this would lead eventually to the creation of Cook County's forest preserves. So we can see here bike riders on the left here as a part of the dedication parade for the 1893 World's Fair, which was right here on the Midway Palisades and to the east along the lakefront. And this was the time that women, feminist women, said, we're out of here. We're not going to stay home at the kitchen. We're going out there. We're going to ride bikes too. And think about a whole generation of grown-ups learning how to ride bicycles. It was probably the first and only generation that had to start as adults, but they took to riding those bikes, the safety bike, as it was called at the time. So soon after the World's Fair of 1893, Chicago created a special Parks Commission that was led by an architect named Dwight Perkins, who would build many of Chicago's schools during this period, and a very charismatic figure, landscape architect Jens Jensen. This was their plan for saving the river watersheds, around the lake, as well as a little harder to see here, the little green dots would be little parks all around the neighborhoods. 5 years later, Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett, in their world famous grand plan, the Plan of Chicago of 1909, would double the amount of acreage set aside for what they called an emerald necklace around Chicago. So neighborhood parks and playgrounds in the city an emerald necklace of forest preserves around it, Chicago would also invent the field house in its public parks to make organized play year round, right? Before this field house was invented, parks would have activities in the summer, but then would basically just close for the winter in terms of any kind of organized play. Now the field house, as well as showers, gymnasiums, all that allowed people to have recreation all year round. And I call this the creation of an urban nature, a sense of people having a stake in the green spaces of the city, in the natural world, in spite of the cement. There's been a lot of really terrific literature lately on this topic. One of them I could recommend is Colin Fisher's Urban Green, Nature, Recreation, and the Working Class in Industrial Chicago. It was 2015. There's some terrific stuff on Latinos' entry into Chicago and their efforts to find green spaces, to find baseball fields and so forth, largely around the steel mill area of the South Side. And as Colin Fisher shows, contestation then over Chicago's green spaces between whites and blacks and Latinos and other ethnics would play a role in setting off the great race riot of 1919. In the aftermath of this horrible tragedy, which many people lost their lives, a year later, they set up a race commission to study its causes. And one discovery was the redlining of a complete lack of public park facilities in the Black Belt ghetto on the near South Side. Here in the map here is sort of a little depicted the black area. And as again, we see parks everywhere around, except no beaches, no parks in Bronzeville. The third route to save the urban environment was the American dream, home ownership in the suburbs. And we would build over 80,000 of these bungalows. It's still probably the most common form of housing in Chicago today are these bungalows largely built in the teens and the 20s, fewer in the 30s during the Depression, of course. These homes, for example, had standardized systems that made them much more affordable than houses before. Why they were so successful, they had standardized lighting systems, standardized gas, standardized plumbing, standardized heating that they could just plug into these buildings, and it made them much cheaper. I know from my studies, they've made them for about $2,500 when we like to buy a house like that for now. And they sold them for about $5,000 because they can make a lot, can make money, and they were very popular. Yet systemic racism was also built into the private real estate market. Homes were sold with what were called restrictive covenants that prevented future sales to non-whites. This creates a sense of a suburban nature, not entirely white, but almost all white on both sides of the city borderline. The success of the bungalow meant that by 1940, as we can see down here in this picture, there's virtually no vacant land left in the city of Chicago within the borders. Very little, and most of that in this kind of grungy industrial zone down by Lake Calumet. The bottom line then was an expansion of the park system and an expansion of the forest preserve system as well. Or they were popular to vote on. City parks meant real estate values would be enhanced around the adjacent property. So real estate people liked it. Everybody liked adding more parks and adding more forest preserves. I mean, it was a winner. Yet little had changed in the environmental inequalities of outdoor recreational facilities for whites and blacks at the end of World War II. So let me pause for a moment here before examining the planning and building of the post-war metropolis. Again, I want to underscore that climate change in Chicago has meant a long-term pattern of more frequent and severe rainstorms. Okay. This is what nature is doing. And at the same time, sprawl has created surface runoff surges, making flooding not only more probable, but also more damaging, making them worse and worse. And clearly we can see here the great housing boom in the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s when we were building up to 45,000 houses in a year, right? And then the apartment building lagging behind, but by the 60s, again, the group building 20,000 apartments a year was also quite a feat. The result, of course, is sprawl. That's the bottom line here. We paved over this flood-prone environment. Any way we look at it in these various diagrams, we see basically Chicago is sprawling out over a huge area. And there's only one little zone, with the purple being D, where people are moving out. The one little zone in the loop area in the city itself is the only area that has seen an increase in population. Otherwise, basically, it's an outward flow. Both this outward flow as well as increasing densities at the center make things really worse. Okay, so here we have to look back to the sewers to handle the problem. And during the dry period, the system basically worked that the engineers had invented in the 1900s. What I'm trying to show here is that here was the design capacity of the sanitary and ship canal, 10,000 engineering terms, 10,000 cubic feet a second as a flow, okay? And by 1910, really, we had reached the capacity of the system as it was designed. But by letting lots of water out over the top of the dam to the point that they would flood downstream, we could almost double that capacity of how much water the sewers could flow into the river without causing a problem of backflows and opening up the locks. So clearly by the time of the end of the war, we were already 50% over capacity, right? In other words, the sewer system could develop 50% more water into the Chicago River than it could handle, which is going to be, and they knew that. They measured these things. They knew the problem. And as you can see, as we suburbanize, the problem has only gotten much, much worse. That's how much water could be dumped in. This is how much we can handle. What's going to happen to all the rest of that water is the question. And how are we going to handle that? Well, after the war, as we know, we elected a boss, Richard J. Daley. He would rule for 20 years from 1955, win an election, one more election in 74, but die a year later in 1975. And his attitude clearly was a refusal to deal with this growing problem. He would rule this area until his death, and for him, the Chicago River remained the back alley, right? Keep the beaches clean for the rich people and the nice people going to the beaches, but don't look into the back alley. It was what economists today would call a sacrifice zone, right? Purposely saying, we're not going to invest here, we're not going to clean this up. This is where the dirt goes, this is where the decay goes, a sacrifice zone. So in 1954 was the beginning of a series of what was so-called 100-year storms, right? New York just experienced what was so-called a 100-year storm. But in Chicago, these 100-year storms started happening every 2 or 3 years, one after the other. As we can see in the 1954 flood, it's showing where did it flood? Just about everywhere. As you can see in this map, there's not too many areas left on this map that didn't flood in the Chicago region. This was a year before Boss Daley, who was already the chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. A year later, he took over as mayor himself. And as we see the year before, we could see in these hydrographs the storm surges, right? Each of these rivers shows this huge, it starts raining, but then again, that surface runoff surge pushes into the river, and we can see each of these rivers going much higher in a big surge up and then back down. That's what was happening, okay? Even a political boss as powerful as Richard J. Daley couldn't stop the weather. This is the limits of his power. 2 years after he took over, another great flood. And here again, in a different kind of a diagram, shows again, most areas of the city, rich and poor, were experiencing great flooding. All right. This growing anger then of hundreds and thousands of people with flooded basements, with schools closed, with the roads, the underpasses getting flooded. People couldn't get to work, right? People were told to stay home from work because it was so flooded, electricity was down, all kinds of problems. People started growing more and more angry. Why aren't our public officials doing something about this? Why aren't they dealing with this? And I think this growing anger and mistrust of the powers that be would create a backlash against the government, against our local and state officials, and would give birth to a new modern environmental movement. This would play into this, I think, a great deal. Anger as much as, let me say, the proto-environmentalists, people who love nature. They're in this too, but there is a lot of anger at our powers that be. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, I think 1962, helped channel Chicagoans' political discontent into an environmental movement. She talked about the abuse of harmful chemicals that was upsetting the balance of nature. In her book, she talks about excessive spraying of DDT to kill the mosquitoes in the suburbs that actually were killing off the birds that ate the bugs. In the city and suburban backyards, there were only sounds of silence that had replaced the birds singing in our backyards. And again, I think the suburban nature, this urban nature plays into this. People did notice this. And when Rachel Carson came along, and it was like, oh yeah, yeah, we get it now, right? The same kind of problems of abuse of nature and the cost of corruption and a consumer's republic culture of profligate waste also caused ecological disruptions of the Great Lakes. The sewage contamination, and especially dumping phosphates in our laundry soap into the lake. It was the phosphates in the detergent that caused these horrible algae blooms, right? Somehow the algae loves the phosphorus, and these algae blooms would then take all the oxygen out of the water, killing off the natural fish. At the same time, by opening up the St. Lawrence Seaway to allow ships from the Atlantic to come all the way into the Great Lakes, they brought with them all these alien species with their bilge water and mussels clinging onto the sides of their boats. And this created other ecological disasters. I remember myself in the 1960s, the invasion of the alewives, right? They actually come from the Black Sea, but now they were in Lake Michigan. And as you can see, they prospered where, the trout and the natural fish had died off. And then their population explosion, I don't know all the biology here, but they had these massive die-offs, right? Where billions of these things landed up on our beaches. You want to go bring your children down to the beach to climb through the alewives? No, it was really smelly, really horrible. And then the flies came to eat the bug, eat the fish. It was a terrible mess, and people got really, really angry. This led eventually to public support for the creation to save the Great Lakes and led to the historic 1972 Clean Water Act, okay, which is really a really important thing. Came at the same time of the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was an important part of it. Also at the same time, this proto-environmental movement stopped the engineers from turning the rivers into sewage and drainage canals like the Chicago River. That was their idea of how to deal with suburban problems. Well, we'll make those rivers, the Des Plaines rivers, the Calumet River, Salt Creek, we'll make them into concrete canals that can handle the sewage just like the Chicago River was. But fishermen, fisherwomen, bird watchers were among the first to understand these ecological connections between the Great Lakes and our rivers. These waters were interconnected, that we may seem like they're different, but the fish and the plants and the mollusks, all these organisms were flowing between the two, between the rivers and the lake. In 1974 saw the formation of the Friends of the River, which was followed by the Open Lands Project and many other modern environmental advocacy groups arguing to save the lakes, save our river watersheds, save our forest preserves. And the rivers began to get cleaner. Rather than dumping chlorine into the river to create dead zones because there was so much bacteria in the water, they stopped doing that. The river started to clean up, and the fish and the water plants started coming back, which brought the birds and the animals back. This was a self-generating process that really didn't involve humans as much as letting the water get clean and plants would grow and so forth. It became interconnected. And I think this leads to kind of a reciprocal process where nature is getting better, and that leads to more support of people wanting to come out and see things like, hey, look, there's beavers in the South Loop, right? There's fish, there's beautiful birds that are now along the riverfront. We want to see that, and that leads to support to more cleanup, more protection for these watersheds. So it becomes a reciprocal process of nature restoration and political support for further restoration. Also, we can see that the businessmen, the real estate developers, and the Central Area Committee finally get on board. Bertram Goldberg, an architect, was one of the among the first. His Marina City project was way ahead of its time to think of the river as an amenity rather than as the back alley that we don't want to look at. The result has been a gradual recentering of the downtown with the Chicago River in the middle, right? West Loop, North Loop developments, this Lincoln Park project Lincoln Yards project is gigantic. On the South Loop too, both sides are being developed with very large residential and commercial properties. There's also been an expansion of the Emerald Necklace, urban and suburban support. Again, we need more parks. We need more forest preserves. You find headline after editorial in the Chicago Tribune, the Sun-Times, we need more parks. We need more forest preserves. It becomes a constant refrain. So the rivers were saved. Finally, in 1965, unexpectedly, Richard J. Daley signs off on the idea of TARP, the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, as they call it, or as most people just call it, the Deep Tunnel. Okay, just a brief explanation. The idea of the engineers was that you take the overflow of the rivers and create an underflow. You send them down these shafts to this very big, deep tunnel that could store up the storm water, the polluted storm water, and after the storm was over, it could pump the water back up to a treatment plant, treat the water, and put that nasty water back into the system, all cleaned up. Okay, and then here was the general plan of where these deep tunnels would run. And again, they said this would solve the problem of both flood and pollution. Okay, so at first no one wanted to fund this because it was going to cost a huge amount of money. right? And this was really, talk about giant scale. That's a human being there. Then I got circles compared, and this was called the mole. As opposed to blasting with dynamite, this thing just bores like a mole through the rocks, okay? To make these giant tunnels that were supposed to hold billions of gallons of this water. And again, shows the whole system of how it would be pumped back up and so forth. And they also planned a couple of reservoirs to handle the overflow of the underflow. Okay, the tunnels filled up, the water could flow into these tunnels. A gigantic plan. The only problem is it doesn't work. Sorry to say, the engineers got it wrong. What we see here is it has cost $4 or $5 billion so far. In effect, we have paved over the land faster than we have dug the tunnels and dug big holes to put all this water. In the meantime, the flooding and use of the lake as an ultimate sink only gets worse. And here again, showing since the tunnel opened in 1985, the huge amounts of water that have been dumped into the lake because the tunnels can't handle all this water. Again, the river rises up. They have to open up the locks. And as we can see, billions of gallons of our sewage dumps into the lake. You want to go swimming the next day on the beach? Probably not. And this has only, in a sense, gotten worse and worse over time as we keep paving and paving. Okay, so we've been trying to build these giant reservoirs, but again, they say now, although they were supposed to be done in 1986, the problem was supposed to be solved. They say, well, maybe another 10 years, we'll be able to dig these tunnels deep enough to hold all the overflow water. Don't hold your breath on that one. Thornton, here we see the one on the south side. This is called the Transitional Reservoir. See how big it is? I mean, these are trucks along here. Here's the real reservoir they're digging. It could become the world's biggest hole. I think by the time they get done, maybe it will hold 8 billion gallons of water or wastewater by the time they get done. Over the last 10 years, certainly the system has failed as they've tried to build these reservoirs and put them into place. We can see that over the last 10 years, we have dumped over 26 billion gallons of wastewater into Lake Michigan. Only 5 years after funding began during a Great Recession, again, what was called Shovel Ready Project was TARP, right? It was ready to go, no one would fund it. During the Great Recession of the 70s, the federal government started picking up the tab to put people back to work. But only 5 years later, the GAO had considered this a loser. It was going to cost way too much money, as we can see here. And they proposed all these different solutions that could help at a much lower cost to solve these problems. Of course, Richard J. Daley and then his son, Richard M. Daley, who would be the mayor from 1989 to 2011, totally refused to enact any of these. If you wanted to get a rain barrel, forget about it. They put it down in 120th Street or something like that. You had to actually go down there and pay a big $50 or something for a barrel to take home. They made it really difficult, right? No, Mayor Daley made one alley of porous pavement. That was the end of the project, right? He had a news conference, TV came, that was about the end of it. So we didn't really do much with that at all. Finally, in 1913, under Rahm Emanuel, the city finally agreed to come into compliance with the 1972 Clean Water Act, right? Until then, Richard M. Daley had held out as the last big city to refuse to come into compliance. In fact, he told the EPA regulators, go jump in the Potomac, River, he told them. They answered back, well, at least we won't die if we jump into the Potomac as opposed to the sewage and pollution of the Chicago River. Rahm Emanuel was much better as an environmentalist. He's the one who signed off on this, and this was the plan here to make parts of the Chicago River swimmable, most of it not. But again, a big, big improvement over what had been before. Rahm Emanuel, of course, continued Daley's and the Central Area Committee's focus on downtown beautification. Emanuel borrowed $50 million from the federal government to build the Riverwalk. Now that's great. I mean, I'm not against the Riverwalk, but who really benefits from it? Think about it. It's the tourists in the downtown loop, businessmen, the hotel people that are benefiting it. But all of us as taxpayers are going to have to pay back that $50 million that he borrowed to build that project. At the same time, we can see that that in areas like Pilsen and Little Village, which are heavily Latino, can you find the green space? Can you find even the river? All of that pink or purple area is supposed to be redeveloped as industry, right? And yet, if you look at the public health records of Chicago, it's the people who live in Pilsen and Little Village who are the most overweight and the most under-exercised, the people who need to get outdoors and do a little running and jogging and some exercise the most, but yet the city continues its program of spatial inequality. So the river is now the centerpiece of open space and wild nature in the downtown, but remains largely off limits to most people outside in the neighborhoods. Briefly, again, I've probably gone over my time, but let me quickly just introduce to you to think about in the future another great problem that we're facing unique to Chicago, and that is this inter-basin connection between all of the Ohio River Valley, the entire Mississippi Valley, and the Great Lakes Basin. And it's only at this one point here in Chicago, the mouth of the river, down here by Calumet, up here by Wilmette, that the two systems interact, okay? And what's happening is this great invasion of alien species on both sides. Things coming from the ocean and other places into Lake Michigan, and things escaping up and down the Mississippi Valley from experimental places to get into the river. The worst is the monster fish, the Asian carp that escaped into the Mississippi River, a monster fish because it can eat and out-eat all of its rivals. Every day it can eat 8 times its own body weight. Think of what your weight is multiplied by 8. Think about eating that much food in one day. A carp can do it. They also jump out of the water and hit boaters and so forth. They're very strange, horrible fish. And if they escape into the Great Lakes, they will totally destroy the game fishing. All the coho salmon, the bass, all the other fish we've finally got growing in the Great Lakes, these fish will destroy it. And there'll be nothing left except Asian carp, which has a very limited appeal for people to eat. On the other side are a whole rogues gallery of invasive species, like the round goby and the roughy. There's also these horrible mussels, or they're not really horrible, but there's now trillions and trillions of them on the bottom of Lake Michigan that are, again, completely upsetting the ecological balance. So this is a great problem. And what's holding this back from one side going to the other is the Army Corps of Engineers electric fence. Now, they promise this will work forever, but you know, there's something about if things can go wrong, they do go wrong sometimes. I'm just wondering if we have some kind of outage of electricity, what's going to happen to the electric fence? It seems to be working pretty good now, but again, I have my doubts. Clearly, to come to a conclusion, we can see that the waters are worth saving. What would Chicago be without Lake Michigan, without our lakefront, without the ability to go down to the beaches or just walk along, ride our bikes and see the lake? Clearly worth saving. And here's a picture from an architect, Jeannie Gang, who's built some wonderful buildings in Chicago, wavy buildings downtown. Is her idea of a restoration rather than our kind of formal beaches with sand. Let's restore the natural lakefront. And she wants to take what was Meg's Field, an airfield, and turn it into an ecological kind of center where there'd be all these kind of things going on to help promote, again, that regeneration of the ecology of the lake. Finally, I would say we need to save our forest preserves and those river watersheds as well. I hope some of you will get out to some of these areas with a kayak or just walking around. They're really beautiful. And I think they've become they end up almost sacred space in Chicago for a lot of people, that we're going to save these forest preserves. So I'll stop with that and hopefully we'll have some questions. Thank you.
So I have some questions coming in online from Zoom that I'll kind of be the voice for here. But our first one is, can you speak to the relationship of political discontent and the civil rights movement to the environmental movement in 1960s Chicago? How did these two overlap?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not too sure how much they overlap, other than maybe people like me that were members of Greenpeace, that sort of, again, Greenpeace were sort of a peace, anti-war efforts joined together with the notions of a greener environment. There was some of that, but I think there's that kind of activism. And as we've talked about before, people like me who were avid tent campers and going out on our canoes in wilderness areas also sort of some of us were also political activists. So I don't know if there's that much of a conscious connection, but I think there was an overlap between the political activist and maybe the environmental activist at the time.
The next one says, your institution, Loyola University, just announced today that they will be divesting from fossil fuels. What does this mean for Chicago and for sustainability?
Lyle's going to do that?
Mm-hmm. Announced today, apparently.
All right. Good for Loyola. Well, obviously, one of our great problems of global warming is this problem of fossil fuels. I don't have to go too deeply into that to say that obviously that's where a lot of our global warming and air pollution comes from. Maybe some of you heard Captain Kirk, William Shatner, yesterday from his voyage into space. He was really profoundly emotionally changed by this one 3-minute experience where he could see the green earth, which he called life, and the blackness of space. Again, remember, he's 90 years old, which he called death. Now, again, as he admitted, many scientists look at the black as the expanse of space, not as death, but for a 90-year-old man, the difference between this little green planet and blue and bright and light and the darkness of space was a very stark contrast. Huh? Yeah.
What do you see as the future potentials of the river? Like, what forms do you think it could take, like even like in an evolution from where it currently stands, as like how it relates to the city? And what do you think would be the best steps to get to like that future?
Well, I would hope that the Chicago River could become more like these that have been more or less preserved as a part of the forest preserves. I mean, that was the smart vision of, we want to make some forest preserve, let's save those river watersheds. I think I favor the idea of many scientists that we should permanently separate, close off the lake from the river, right? We could close off the mouth of the Chicago River and have all that water just going downstream and not have this problem of the invasive species. And I think about if the river was closed at the mouth and you could, or at the junction where it branches to north and south, you could open up those locks. Boats could kind of come into Marina City all the way to the merchandise mart and back, and then the river would be the river. And again, that all depends, I think, a lot on the laggard city in cleaning up the water, right? Right now, we occasionally see kayakers on the Chicago River, but I don't think anyone wants to swim in the river. It's still way, even they say if you kayak, make sure you wash your hands and any place that touches the Chicago River water. So we have a long way to go, unfortunately, and not that we don't have the technology, we haven't put the money into building those treatment facilities and at the level of 95% or whatever purity that we have had for 50 years, but we just haven't paid to put those systems in place. But if we do, if you've been on the Chicago River, there's some really nice places on the Chicago River, right? And there's been groups that go and clean up every year, all the garbage and tons and tons of stuff, but as it gets cleaner, it turns out each year there's less and less garbage thrown there. That kind of notion. So it's gotten better.
Great. So our next question is from Evan Carver, who is a professor in the Environmental and Urban Studies program here, and it's a bit of a long one. I'll just let you know in advance.
Better have a footnote.
It has a lot of context. It says, it's been a while since I read the book, so I'm not sure if I'm remembering the episode correctly, but can you say more about the founding of Evanston? They were Quakers, but also wanted to take advantage of the better water situation several miles north or something like that. I'm reading this directly. Can you say more about how the belief system related to the urban design sensibility? For some context, I teach a class called Sustainable Urban Development, in which we spend some time debating how values, ethical systems, worldviews, and so on can or could or should play a role in ecological urban design and planning.
Okay, to talk about the Evanston situation, again, Lake Michigan has its own currents, right? And it sort of goes in a counterclockwise direction. So along our lakefront here, the water flows from the north to the south towards Michigan City. And so Evanston being north, dumping its sewage into the lake, the sewage would flow down to Chicago, right, to Rogers Park and Edgewater and so forth. And so that maybe he's referring to that in the book of the controversy of, what Evanston does affects what happens in Chicago. That again, there's these interconnections and we have to do more to coordinate. In terms of the ethics or of the environment, again, I think that's a really big question, a really big issue that I probably can't deal with right now. Okay.
Maybe I can ask one, Harold.
Sure.
So I am really interested in, again, it's kind of a values question. As you're telling kind of the long arc of history here, I keep hearing these, on the one side, a very clear kind of technocratic impulse, right? That we are going to solve our problems by digging a bigger hole or a longer canal, or, we're going to electrify a fence, and that is going to solve all of our problems. And on the other hand, I hear this kind of broad preservationist impulse that, as I'm looking at these landscapes, was obviously successful, but it seems to have only been ascendant for a couple of decades during the progressive era, when you have kind of these massive regional urban planning efforts like the Emerald Necklace Plan, for example. I see clearly kind of the market impulse and what draws us back over and over again to these kind of easy technocratic solutions. What do you see pulling us? Is there anything that you see kind of in the zeitgeist right now that's pulling us in that other direction, that's pulling us back to that sort of more preservationist or conservationist impulse that was so powerful, it seems, at the turn of the century? Any glimmers of hope or sort of ethical currents that you see that are maybe pulling us back in that direction right now?
Well, again, this is just opinion, but I what I see is more people on bicycles, certainly a growing culture of environmental concern, concerns about the climate change, and then these dramatic events that it's like climate change is here. People are finally beginning to accept it when their house is blown away or under a flood, or in New York where they've had these, the 100-year flood. I think that has led a lot of support to the notion that we've got to do something about it. And my key word here is adaptation rather than resilience, which is often used. I'm not against resilience, but resilience sort of, to me, is like fighting back, right? Where adaptation is going with the flow, so to speak. That there's a lot of ways we can go with the flow, like rain barrels. I mean, it doesn't make much difference, but 1 million rain barrels makes a difference, right? If people store that water up for a little bit, while it's, again, these surges are happening, enough people do it, it does make a difference. Rain gardens on people's roofs. I mean, all this can add up, and people are trying often to make those little steps, right? People may feel good to have a rain barrel, but it actually helps if we do it over these broad periods. So I think that's where we can go. Porous pavement, I know at Loyola, when they've done a lot of this, of taking out the old pavement, and you put in these sort of like blocks, right, that have spaces in between so that the water can soak in the open spaces, but it's still paved. It makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't have to be done overnight. As you build new roads, as you build new sidewalks, that happens all the time. Why not build them as porous and environmentally friendly? Another really good idea that we see in Syria and other countries that have very little water is that they like in Morocco, you would have a little fountain in a garden, and then little channels that would go to each plant, maybe 4 trees around the fountain, right? So it wasn't just spraying the water up like our typical way of doing it, but channeling the water specifically. Now think about our curbs. If we took those curbs and channeled the water running in the street curbs onto the parkways, we'd be able to, again, plant lots of beautiful plants along the parkways and yet deal with the water problem, again, in a very passive, adaptive way. There's many things we can do like that. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much
Hi.
for coming to talk to us today. And I'm really interested to learn about all of the downriver solutions and options you shared with us. But I'm also wondering about the wider Great Lakes region and other major cities like Chicago and how they're handling it. I'm thinking specifically like a city like Toronto and how they're handling what must be a similar situation that Chicago is dealing with, and if there's some kind of international or national policy cooperation situation that you've even heard of. I don't know, so that's why I'm just wondering about that. Thank you again for coming.
Sure. Well, there is actually since the 1900s, there's been an international Great Lakes Commission of the Canadians and the United States that runs through the national governments, right? But also the Great Lakes states are also parties in a sense to this, since Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all these states that border are also concerned because the lakes are also interconnected, right? And except for Lake Superior, which is kind of higher, and the water just flows out into the rest of the lakes, but all the rest of the lakes, the water flows all the way to the Great Lakes. So every city is trying to deal with the problems of sewage, of contaminated water, more or less. I mean, there's these horrible algae blooms that have reappeared in some of the Great Lakes, right? And of course, there's less pollution from public sewage treatment plants going to lakes, but as Sam Bass-Warner and other historians point out, there's a tremendous amount of surface runoff. Just the streets, the oil and gunk that goes on the streets can run off and get into the rivers. That's a real problem. And also from farm areas along the Great Lakes. right? There's all this fertilizer, again, the phosphates that are draining off the lake, off the land when it rains from the farms and finding its way into the lake. So I think maybe now some of the farm runoff problems are probably larger than the urban problems, except for like Chicago when it has these huge river reversals dumping water in. So that's sort of trying to deal with some of these problems all along the entire border of the Great Lakes to deal with surface runoff that somehow gets into waterways and then finds its way into the lake. That's the big problem.
I realize we gave some priority to the folks who are on Zoom. Folks here, if you do have a question, happy to bring the mic to you.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
Were there any more?
Oh,
Oh,
another
we
one?
got one more. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Bringing the mic back to Tess.
Sorry, last one here.
That's all right.
It's from Alora on Zoom. They ask, if we do not do something sustainable soon to address climate change to make a real impact, how long do you think it will be before the city is underwater and flooded long term? What needs to happen to ensure that that does not happen?
Well, it won't happen because they're going to keep, as we saw before, they're going to keep opening up the locks. And as we saw, up to what, 10, 11 billion gallons in a single event being dumped into there. So they're not going to let the loop flood. That's pretty clear. Once it almost did in Commonwealth Edison, which has power plants along the South Branch. It shut down because it was flooded. The railroads had to shut down because they're right along the lakefront too, right? The metro trains. And it was a total disaster for the city. Everything shut down. So that's the solution, is open up the locks and keep digging the tunnels. But again, they just seem, one of the tunnels, one of the big reservoirs, McCook, is open now, 2 billion gallons. Again, it just doesn't hold enough water. And that's been the problem. And the contracts were set up very nicely for the detail for the contractors. If they can't make enough money selling the gravel and the stuff they dig out, they don't have to work. Only if the price is high enough that they can make a profit do they actually have to work and keep digging. So that's why they first said 2029 they'll be done, but who knows how long it will take. And again, what they've planned isn't big enough as it is. So we will face these problems for quite a time in the future, with, again, the solution being the lake is the ultimate sink, which has led, as many Chicagoans know, to a lot of beach closings, for days or weeks afterwards, because the pollution level is too high. And someone asked about activism. There's a lot of people out there now collecting water samples in the lake when these things happen, and they're testing for bacteria levels. So that's another form of citizen activism to deal with these problems or respond to them anyhow.